Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about the weighted pull-up and why it is one of the best all-around upper body exercises you can do. And yes, it is absolutely better than things like the lat pull downs, and it has to do with all the muscle activation and everything that happens during this exercise. And I think particularly when you do the full range of motion on it, what I mean by that is actually locking your elbows at the bottom so that you actually get a stretch on the triceps and everything else. And a lot of it is obvious. I mean, a lot of things are obvious on this exercise. People are like, well, obviously it works the biceps, the rear delts, the traps, the lats, the forearms, works your grip, all of those things. And that's all true. And it's a great exercise for all of those muscle groups. However, when you start looking at the functionality of it and the ability to train really solid workloads with it, it actually is really a winner. And a lot of it has to do with all the stabilizing involved, and it has to do, again, with some of the ranges of motion and stuff involved. And when I mean all the stabilizers, again, we're talking about all the extra muscles that get involved in your core, like your abdominals, intercostals, things like that. But then in addition to all of that, particularly when you go all the way to the bottom, this exercise tends to recruit the long head of the tricep. Puts a stretch on that, and that is the one head of the tricep that gets the least overall stimulation on pressing, and it's actually the largest of the three heads. So when we start talking about relative training volumes, this is an exercise that for things like the triceps, it can add some additional volume, even though we don't think it as a primary mover there. It can add some additional volume to what for many people is the weakest head of the tricep. So that we can get some further growth stimulation. Because ultimately, even if you do a lot of exercises that don't maybe work any given muscle as ideally as you might want, you're always going to get some carryover effect. And things are about getting to an effective amount of volume overall in your training to stimulate adaptation. So when you start thinking of things like if you're doing a lot of bench pressing or weighted dips or whatever, and that long head of the tricep maybe is only getting partial stimulation, and maybe not quite enough to give it the effective growth response you want, doing things like adding in these weighted pull-ups can go ahead and stimulate that head further. And if it's lagging or getting just slightly insufficient training load, it can give it enough to stimulate some new adaptation. And so there's a large advantage there. And it's the same thing when we talk about the upper chest, because the upper chest does get involved in pull-ups, right? It gets involved quite a bit. And so in doing so, again, the upper chest is for many people who don't do large amounts of say, overhead pressing, full range of motion overhead pressing, or incline bench. The upper chest for some people can be a muscle group that lags overall. And we're not just talking about aesthetics, we're talking about overall performance. Because if it's involved in a motion like pulling yourself up, there is some real world carryover to that. So you have some upper chest involvement. So again, people who are doing a lot of benching and dips and things like that, if their upper chest isn't quite getting the amount of stimulation they want, this exercise can possibly add just a little more to push it over that edge to get your minimum effective training volume for the week. So it has a lot of value there. Then we go to things like the grip, the biceps, brachialis, all of that. There's all of that to consider. But as far as grip training goes, look, if you're coming in doing several heavy sets of this every week, you are getting additional grip work in, and that will carry over to your overall grip strength. It will carry over to your deadlifts, and just improve all around your grip, your forearms, and those things. So again, there's a lot of merit that it has there due to the nature of the exercise. That your grip does get worked harder on this because you're pulling yourself up against the bar than some other exercises you might do that are a little more finesse with a lighter weight. So again, another benefit to it there. And then we also have the fact that it moves the entire body through space. All right, and now this is a perk for obviously the chin-up also, but I'll get to why the pull-up might be more useful in certain ways than a chin-up. But yeah, any exercise that moves your body through space was something that the Russians looked at years ago during the Cold War, and they had data on it showing that any exercise that moves your body through space does seem to elicit a slightly better training response. And that's one reason the barbell squat is so good, because the barbell squat does move your entire body through space. It has a lot of stabilization involved with big, heavy weights. It's one thing when we start talking about, stabilizers are added, but you're doing a really awkward lightweight. It's not the same thing as when you're doing something where you can move some real poundages on. And squats are one of those, but so are things like the weighted pull-up. There does seem to be a large splashover effect through the body in various muscles of doing that. So again, this is a benefit that it adds over something like a machine or a lat pull down. So you're going to get more overall growth potential there. Now, when we come to things like the bicep development, that's where it gets interesting, because we do know, because of the hand position, it does work a little more tricep than the chin-up does. But in theory, it should work a little less bicep. But that's also one of those things to where, if we look at the studies, on these things, that's not as clear-cut and dry as it might appear, because we start looking at hypertrophy studies, we find that even lat pull-downs done with an overhand grip seem to produce just as much muscle growth if volume is equal as bicep curls do, even concentration curls on a machine. And so maybe that angle isn't as important as we think it is if what happens, if we have enough training volume. If you're only going to do one set for the week, heavy all-out set, okay, that exercise selection there might matter more. But when you start doing multiple sets and you start ramping up significant amount of fatigues, things like that extra angle on the bicep there may not matter that much. So it would very possibly, and again, this has not really been studied for long term, it very possibly might end up having very close to, if not the same, bicep development that a weighted chin-up would have. But there is a different advantage to it. Even though it doesn't put it in that supinated position, the pronated position does put more stretch on the bicep, right? Because you do stretch the muscle further at the lockout with a pronated grip, which is, again, the palms forward on the pull-up versus the palms facing you, which is a chin-up. So even though you might get a stronger contraction with the underhand grip, the overhand grip gets a deeper stretch. And so that's why going all the way down is really beneficial on this exercise. And in fact, you'll notice that in your biceps quite tremendously. But here's the other advantage. It doesn't seem to put as much stress on that tendon, the tendon where the bicep inserts into the forearm. And that's something I've noticed in the past, that heavy weighted chin-ups, particularly done real heavy, can cause a pretty large amount of inflammation in that. For me, for someone who has an old injury there, I can get a lot of inflammation from doing that. But with weighted pull-ups, I can do multiple sets, multiple times a week, even fairly heavy, and I don't get that same inflammation. So people who are prone to that bicep tendon inflammation, or worried about overuse injuries there, the pull-up can, in theory, allow you to get more training volume without causing that localized connective tissue inflammation that can impede your training, can make life uncomfortable, can even interfere with things like your ability to squat, to bench press, all of that stuff if it becomes too severe. So because it removes that from the equation, it can, for many people, allow for more overall training volume. And if you can do more overall training volume and more overall workload and tonnage in these things, it's going to have more potential to elicit a larger training response. So it's just something interesting to look at with this exercise in regards to that hand position. And then we also have to look at the hand position from a functional perspective. And I'm not saying chin-ups and rows and everything else won't make you better at pulling yourself up something. But if we're going to talk about, again, real-world carryover, let's talk about real-world carryover, whether it's military applications or firefighters or anything else. People who might need to grab something and pull themselves up, whether it's climb up a rope, pull themselves up a tree, pull themselves up a building ledge, all these different scenarios that exist, it is a little more sport specific. And I'm not saying all the other pulling exercises won't help you with that, because they will. But, if we're going to be tit for tat and look at the specifics, if you pull yourself up something like that, you're going to usually have an overhand grip. And so this does train that better. And because, again, you can get that deeper stretch, it's going to train you to pull yourself up these things from a full stretch, which is what you very well might have to do in those sort of situations. So all in all, when we start looking at all the muscles worked, all the benefits to it, the weighted pull-up really appears to be an overall superior exercise for the entire upper body. Not just the primary movers, again, like the biceps, the forearms, rear delts, lats, all that stuff, but a lot of secondary muscles. There's a lot of secondary muscles involved. And so therefore, in many ways, it is actually a fairly complete, and about as complete as you're going to get, as far as an upper body exercise that works the majority of the muscle fibers through the entire upper body. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.